Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another video from my channel Interactive Education, running for the best education possible from the student to the student for a better experience. And today we're going to continue the chapter we had taken up before, that is reproduction in organisms, also called how do organisms reproduce. And I like calling this reproduction in organisms, so if you see, even though the title is how do organisms reproduce, I like calling it reproduction in organisms. It's a more sophisticated term. And today we're going to discuss the first form of reproduction, that is asexual form of reproduction. Now, in the last video, I have discussed the difference and the meaning of both, difference between asexual and sexual reproduction and both their concepts in a lot of detail. Please look it up if you have any doubt regarding that. But today we're going to just start off with in detail what asexual reproduction is, and we've discussed how it actually takes place. But a general definition of asexual reproduction, as we all know, is reproduction which involves only one parent. So basically a form of reproduction where there is no fertilization. There is no fertilization of male and female gametes. There is no sex cells or gametes, but there is only one parent which gives its genetic material, or we can say extends its genetic material, produces its genetic material, and gives rise to other organisms. That is called asexual form of reproduction. Now, asexual form of reproduction has many types. There are various types of asexual form of reproduction. And if we look into detail, what are the different types of asexual reproduction? There are many types of asexual reproduction, and there are even more than what your textbook suggests. But I will be taking up only the ones which are given to you in your textbook. Asexual reproduction are of many kinds. There's many kinds of asexual reproduction. There is fission. Okay, we'll discuss what this is. We'll discuss everything. Fission. Then there is budding. There is fragmentation. There is spore formation. Spore formation. There is vegetative propagation. And these are all which we've learnt in our lower classes. Propagation. But there's one more which is newly introduced in your course this year, that is regeneration. Let's give me a minute. Regeneration. Generation. So there are these forms of reproduction. There is fission, budding, fragmentation, spore formation, vegetative propagation, and a new form of sexual reproduction, regeneration, which is newly introduced to you. However, we've learned all of these in our lower classes in 7th and 8th standard. So, fission. First of all, let us take up fission. Fission is further divided into two kinds. Right, let's have a look at that. There is binary fission and there is multiple fission. Right? So this is the classification of asexual form of reproduction. Now let's have a look at them in detail. Fission process. If we look at fission, and if I just write it down, the first process is fission. Fission basically means division. So fission is basically called division. When there is division of the organism, when the organism basically divides to form daughter cells. So division into daughter cells. And this fission process is a cellular level reproduction. That is, it takes place at the cellular level. There are no complex organs, and it does not usually take place in multicellular organisms. It only takes place in unicellular organisms in the form of cell division. Right, so basically there's cell division, right? Basically it involves the division into daughter cells. One cell divides into daughter cells, right? And it basically is a cellular level of reproduction, which mainly involves cell division, about which I've discussed in a lot of detail, I must say, in my course on cell division. Please look that up. It's an 11th standard portion, but it's an excellent and one of the most interesting chapters in biology as a whole. Basically, cell division has been discussed in a lot of detail in that course. So fission basically means the division into daughter cells. When there is division, right, that's called fission. And you know, there is one fission also in chemistry, that is nuclear fission. Let me make it clear, nuclear fission is not the same as this fission. This nuclear fission is based on physics and chemistry. It's more of that portion, but this is biology, right? So nuclear fission is where the atom or the nucleus of an unstable radioactive atom, okay, that is, you know, bombarded by large nuclei to produce energy and neutrons and all that. We can go in a lot of detail for that, but it's not required. So I just want to make sure that you don't get confused. Nuclear fission is, you know, a cell is based on atoms, and it's, you know, a chemical nuclear reaction, whereas fission is basically a form of reproduction. On the other hand, some people ask if this nuclear fission, which is a process which is used to generate energy, which we must have learned in the physics sources of energy chapter in class 10, if you have done that, nuclear fission releases energy. Right? It's a nuclear reaction which releases energy, but nuclear fission takes up energy. And we've discussed how in my course on cell division basically uses ATP molecules, and with the use of that ATP molecule, it ultimately divides into further daughter cells, right? So I just want you to remember that they're both different, they're not the same. Some people do get confused, so please don't do that. Now, this is a basic intro of fission, where there is a division into daughter cells, there is cellular level of reproduction, there is cell division, and it takes up energy in the form of ATP to do so. Now, there are two kinds of fission mainly. There are two kinds of fission. The first kind of fission is binary fission. Binary fission basically involves the division of one single cell into two daughter cells. We know that the word binary, bi means two. This word refers to the number 2. So basically, division of a cell into two daughter cells is called binary fission, right? That is division into two daughter cells, right? Division into two daughter cells. Now, some people very often ask, and it's a very general question, when there is cell division, why do we say daughter cells and why don't we say son cells or, you know, child cells simply, or offsprings? Offspring is a correct term, but we don't say son cell. This is big, and why do we call it daughter cell? You know that commonly in human beings and in many of the organisms, many of the multicellular organisms or the organisms which have different genders, you will see that usually it's the female which is responsible for producing the offspring. Ultimately, it's the female which is responsible for the birth of the offspring. So we know that these two cells which have developed, which have, you know, after the breaking down, these cells have developed or they have formed, these cells are again going to further divide. So since they have the capacity to reproduce yet again, we call them daughter cells. Okay, that's why we call them daughter cells. That's the main simple reason behind us calling them daughter cells, because they're going to further divide and they're going to give birth to other offspring. So that's why we call them daughter cells. Now let's have a look at how we are going to, you know, how binary fission will actually take place. Let's come back to binary fission. Now, how does this binary fission take place? Let's take the example, very simple example of amoeba. Amoeba, the unicellular protozoan, It takes up binary fission for reproduction, and again it is basically following the method of cell division. How does it do that actually? I'm not going to go much into detail for that, right? You can look up my cell division series for that, but now I'm just going to go as per a very basic format. First of all, we know that amoeba is a unicellular organism which has many finger-like projections of its cell membrane, right? And these projections are called pseudopodia, right? So this is a very simple amoeba, right? That's what happens in the amoeba. So there are these projections called pseudopodia. First of all, the amoeba is going to protrude these pseudopodia back into its cell membrane and usually form a cell or an amoeba which has very less protrusions. So something like this. It's going to bring back all its, pseudopodia. It does not want those pseudopodia anymore because it's getting ready to reproduce, to divide. So it avoids, those projections. So it protrudes those projections back and it forms a, more regular cell membrane. So you can write here, this is the, recalling, I call it recalling of pseudopodia. So the pseudopodia are brought back in, right? The projections are brought back in. Okay, so pseudopodia are recalled. So the pseudopodia are recalled and the cell membrane is made a bit more regular. Next, the amoeba, the next step what it's going to do, that it has to divide its nucleus. Now we know it's going to take up two cells to divide into two cells. Both cells will require genetic material. Both cells will require some coordinating center. So obviously they both will require nuclei. So it's going to first divide its nucleus, and we know this takes place because there is karyokinesis first in the cell division process, which is division of the nucleus. Again, I've discussed this in a lot of detail in my cell division series. That's why I'm telling you, if you find this interesting and if you want to really read about it, that's the best place to go, my series in cell division. Now, recalling of pseudopodia. The next step, again, as I told you, the division of the nuclei. So to show the division of the nuclei, basically show, a normal amoeba. And first, the nuclei is dividing. That is, there needs to be something like this. Okay, so there's going to be something like this, and there's going to be another nuclei. So you can see here that this nuclei right here, which was single right here, there was a single nuclei. Now this nuclei is breaking into two. Can you see that? They're breaking into two, and this is just a connection showing that they're just about to divide, right? The nuclei are just about to divide, and this is called nuclear division. The best term to show this, as we know, a more technical term is karyokinesis. And I've discussed this again in a lot of detail in my cell division series, karyokinesis. So the nucleus is dividing. Right, the nucleus divides to give birth to two nuclei for the respective, daughter cells. The next thing which is going to take place is the division of the cytoplasm, the division of the cell membrane and cytoplasm. Again, now after the nuclei divide, now you need to show, division of the cytoplasm, and this is very easy. Just show a small, something like this, right? And then again, on the other side, you have again something like this. Okay, and it's like this. And both have independent nuclei. So there's one nuclei here, and there's one nuclei here. So you can see here, now, after the division of the nuclei, there's a division of the cytoplasm. So see, now the cytoplasm of the cells is dividing. They're coming together, sorry, they're going away from each other, and they are trying to divide, move away from each other. So here the nuclei were going away from each other. Now here the cytoplasms are moving away from each other. And the final product of this, and this is your cytoplasmic division. Cytoplasmic division, which has another very technical term associated, cytokinesis. Again, I've discussed this in a lot of detail in my cell division series. And finally, we move on to the last step we're going to get, that is two different cells two different amoebic cells. So this is the first cell, and this is gonna be your second cell. So you will see you will get two daughter cells. Two daughter cells after the process of division. And you see, this is how the amoeba divides to give birth to its two daughter cells, and this is the best example of binary fission in amoeba. So this is how binary fission takes place in amoeba, and it's one example of this process of binary fission. I hope that's clear to you, binary fission, and this diagram is very, very important as for your examination point of view. It's an important diagram. Even please go through your textbook. It's good. And it's a very easy diagram to draw. Nothing so tough. So this is what takes place in binary fission in amoeba, right? So that's the process of binary fission, breaking into two daughter cells, right? Now let's move on to the next form of fission. That is, the next form of fission is multiple fission. Now, it's the same process. It's just like binary fission. It's you have a cell, and that cell is breaking apart, right, into daughter cells. But the difference is, in binary fission, we are supposed to get two daughter cells. But in multiple fission, we get more than two daughter cells. So more than two daughter cells. Just a second, please. Just give me a second, I think. Yep. Now, more than two daughter cells. So there are more than two daughter cells which are produced. That's the only difference. It's the same thing. They're dividing into daughter cells, but here you have more than two daughter cells. Let's take an example. We know that there is a particular kind of protozoan which is called Plasmodium. And this Plasmodium is a protozoan. And this is a protozoan which causes malaria. Right? That's your Plasmodium. So this one Plasmodium, again a protozoan, further breaks into its daughter cells. Let's see how. So let's take yellow, my favorite, to draw on this board. So let's take a simple Plasmodium. So you know this is a simple Plasmodium. Looks something like this. Okay. I'm not good at drawing this Plasmodium, so if it doesn't come out too well, please forgive me. So this is going to be your Plasmodium. This is the Plasmodium, right? Suppose. So this one cell here is the Plasmodium cell. So if it wants to divide, if it wants to, multiply, so now this cell has to divide, right? This has to divide. So basically what happens is the nucleus, this particular nucleus, right? Inside, only the nucleus will divide into many nuclei. So this nucleus here, it divides into many nuclei. Divides into many nuclei. Many nuclei are produced, right? So many nuclei are produced. You will see that there are many nuclei. It divides into several nuclei. Right? That's the thing. Next thing, this cytoplasm too will divide. I'm not showing all this because it's very complex. It's better we don't look at it in too much detail. So the cytoplasm too divides, and it gathers around this nuclei. So you see the cytoplasm will also divide and will gather around the nuclei. So you have something here, then something here, then you have another cell here, another cell. So you see here, if you look closely, there's the formation of numerous cells, right? And the same is going to take place here. There's going to be a nuclei here, there's going to be a nuclei here, there's going to be a nuclei here covered with the cell membrane and a cytoplasm, nuclei here, then nuclei here, then nuclei here, then nuclei here, then a nuclei somewhere here. So you see here, this is what it's going to look like. There's going to be division of this into so many cells. These are all separate individual cells. And this is just, like a form of a very protective layer. And these plasmodium are very, very clever. These daughter cells of the plasmodium are really, really clever. They're just waiting for their chance. Once this coating breaks, voila, they are going to distribute and spread the disease. So these are all the daughter cells of the plasmodium. So you see, it's basically dividing the cell, that plasmodium cell is dividing into many, many daughter cells. So since it's definitely more than two, we call it multiple fission. Right, I hope that's absolutely clear. That's what we call multiple fission. When that particular cytoplasm, that particular plasmodium is dividing into many, many, many daughter cells, that's what we call daughter cells. And that's what we call the binary multiple fission in plasmodium. Right, I hope multiple fission is clear to each and every one of you. Please, if you have any doubts, please post them in the comment section below. I will definitely look them back. So that's all with fission. Now we move to the next form of asexual reproduction, that is budding. Now, how does budding take place, and what is actually budding? What do we call budding? And what is budding actually? Let's have a look. Again, we've done this in our lower classes. This next form of reproduction, asexual reproduction to be precise, is budding. So what is budding? Budding is basically a form of asexual reproduction where there is a protrusion, where a particular bud, right? There is a, development of bud or projections, development of bud or projection, developing outside the organism's body, or better to say outside the plant organism's body. So let's have a look at how this takes place. Basically what is happening is there is a bud, there is a projection, there is a protrusion, a specific protrusion, and that protrusion develops into a new individual. It develops into a new organism, right? So that is your budding, where that bud, that projection, that protrusion is developing, right? So let's take an example. There are two very prominent examples by which this budding is explained, right? There is, example of yeast, the yeast cells, right? The bacteria, that yeast develops, that develops by budding. And another very good example of an aquatic plant which takes up budding is Hydra, the Hydra plant, which is present in the water. I'll be explaining the Hydra with a diagram because, it's what's there in the textbook. So if you get it in the exam, Hydra is something very commonly asked. Yeast is also very important, but the diagram of yeast is usually not asked. But Hydra is something really important. Yeast is okay. Yeast, you should know yeast, how it takes place. It's there in the 7th standard textbook, but I'm going to take up Hydra now. So let's see how Hydra, takes up budding. There's a body, right? There's one body of the Hydra. So something like this. There's something like this. There's a body of the Hydra. Okay, and there's one body of the Hydra. Okay, and there are various, kind of these things. There are many, many such things which are being produced out of the Hydra's body. These are called the tentacles of the Hydra, right? These are called the tentacles of the Hydra. Now I know that there are various other protrusions in the Hydra. Please forgive me if the diagram is not so accurate because I'm not gone through this diagram much. So this is the first thing. This is an independent Hydra, right? It's just standing in water and it has its tentacles just out, right? That's an independent Hydra. independent hydra. Now bud starts developing. Now the actual show begins. Basically, we have the bud. So we have a diagram of the hydra, right? That starts up, that's the hydra. Okay, so that's the hydra. So now what the thing is going to take place is there's going to be a bud which is starting to develop. So that's what's happening here. Just at the bottom of the hydra, you know, there is something like this which is developing, right? Something, you know, something like this. In the next step, so, you know, this is the bud which is developing. Next thing which is going to take place is the development of that bud further on. So the bud is going to develop further. Right, the bud will develop further on. I'm not showing the upper part of the hydra now, right? So this bud will develop further on and will develop tentacles, right? So ultimately, at the end, this hydra will develop so much. Okay, this bud is going to develop again. So this bud will develop and it's going to develop really well as an adult, almost really mature. And once it gets matured, right after its maturation, it will ultimately form an individual organism, right? Just like its parent. So if you see, these are the tentacles of the hydra, and with the hydra there is a small baby hydra. So an offspring hydra will be produced, which is going to again have tentacles like its parent. So you see, that is how it is going. Ultimately, this bud right here is developing into an adult hydra, a mature hydra. So the development of the bud, the development by which, or the process by which this bud develops, a bud, a protrusion develops, okay, outside the plant organism's body. Since you can see that that's out of the plant organism, and it is coming out of the plant organism and forming an individual organism, so the offspring. This process is known as budding, right? But there is a slight difference between the budding. Yeah, yeast takes up a similar form, but there's a slight difference. In the yeast, right, unlike the hydra, in the hydra you can see that the projection ultimately will come out of the plant body and form an independent organism. Unlike this in the hydra, in the yeast, the bud may or may not separate out. So you could see in the hydra that at the end we had an independent organism forming. But in yeast, that's not the case. In the yeast, that bud may come out, right? Or it may not come out. That's okay. It may just keep growing. That bud organism which has already developed again may grow further. So this again, growth will lead to a spreading of the bacteria. So this is how budding takes place in hydra, and a slight difference in the budding in yeast, right? So that's budding. That's all with budding, right? I hope budding is clear to you. Now let us move to the next form of asexual reproduction. Now let's look at what's the next form. Next is fragmentation. Have a look at fragmentation now. Now, fragmentation. Okay, before we move on to fragmentation, let's look at something very important in budding. You saw in budding unlike fission, where there's just one cell which is dividing, you saw that there is a particular point. See, there's a particular point where the bud is present, and that bud is growing, continuously growing, and you could see it's growing into a mature organism, then it's growing back into another mature organism, and ultimately it's growing into a completely full offspring. But one thing to note here is that this bud is not a single cell. It is a collection of cells. These collection of cells came together, continuously divided, and formed such an organism. So you see that reproduction may be division of a single cell or the division of a collection of cells, right? That's a very important point to note here. There are some organisms like Hydra is a multicellular organism, and obviously it requires such organs, such locations where development, there are special locations or special cells which are basically, made for it, basically made, created, or which are meant for the process of reproduction. As you can see in Hydra, the bud cells are meant for that. But you can see in fission, there's no such thing. The whole cell divides, right? So that's a major difference between the two. Let's go on to the next form of asexual reproduction, that is fragmentation. Now this video will be a bit long since we are discussing all the forms of asexual reproduction. I will discuss vegetative propagation in another video, but this video will discuss all the forms of asexual reproduction, right? But we'll discuss vegetative propagation in a separate video since it's a bit long. So fragmentation. Fragmentation is, very, very, very simple, and it is somewhat similar to cell division. However, it is very, very, it's slightly different. Please just have a note of that. Let's see how this fragmentation takes place. Basically, fragmentation, as the name suggests, is breaking of a cell. Breaking of cell to form offsprings. To form offsprings. So it is basically a breaking of the cell to form offsprings, right? The cell body breaks to form offsprings. Let's have an example. So for example, let us take the example of Spirogera. You know that Spirogera, it's an algae, green algae present in stagnant water reservoirs. It was there in the 9th standard, practicals. We had to look up Spirogera. So you can see that there is, a collection of the cells. That's your alga. It's an algae. It's basically, that's what we call a Spirogera. So let's take the example of Spirogera. Okay, Spirogera is an algae. We've discussed about that. Now the Spirogera, at a point, sometime in its life, develops a certain crack in its body. This. A certain, jolting or crack or some kind of breaking, right? At a point when it wants to divide, when it finally wants to reproduce at a point, it, develops this crack or this, a kind of separation in between or through its center. And ultimately, this crack breaks the Spirogera, right? This results in the breaking of the Spirogera, and this Spirogera breaks into fragments. So something like this. So you can see there is one fragment here, right? So this is all one fragment, and there is another fragment here. Right, there's another fragment here. So these are two fragments which are produced, and further on you will see that they will develop into full-fledged Spirogera. So this is fragment 1, this is fragment 2. So an example of fragmentation is Spirogera, where there is a breaking of not a cell to say, but an organism. It's better not to say cell. Cell is a wrong term, you should say organism, right? One organism, or small or a very lower organism. Fragmentation is a very, I would call it a primitive form of asexual reproduction, because it's a very, very unevolved form of reproduction. So this is basically breaking into F1 and F2. So that's how fragmentation takes place. It's breaking into two fragments, and these will then finally develop into independent adult Spirogera, right? So that's an example of fragmentation. So till now we've discussed fission, budding, and fragmentation. Now we move on to the next form of reproduction, that is spore formation. Now let's have a look at spore formation. So the fourth form of reproduction which we are discussing is number 4, spore formation. In spore formation, it's very easy. There is a particular spore produced, right? There is a spore. So basically there is development of development of certain organisms, and it's usually fungi. You will see that they're usually fungi, right, in hot and humid conditions. So you will see that in a lot of cases some fungus usually develops on our bread if we keep it in a hot and humid condition. Don't keep it in the fridge. You will see that some white substance gets, covered, a covering of white kind of covering, develops on the bread, and that's nothing but your fungi. It's fungus, and if you have a look at it, that's what you'll get. It's a fungi, and basically that is something you call rhizopus. To be frank, it is rhizopus, and rhizopus is a fungi which develops on bread. And it is also called bread mold, right? So let's see how it looks. When you take that bread and you look it up under the microscope, so you'll see that this is the structure of the rhizopus. You will see that there is a certain base kind of thing, right? A certain base. From that base there are certain these projections which are coming out. Again, you'll see another one. That's what you'll see, right? And on these stick-like thingies, you will see some, spherical bowl kind of structures, right? So that's what it's going to look like. These bowl kind of structures, right, which are developing on these sticks or these projections are called sporangia. Right? Sporangium is singular, sporangia is the plural, right? That's what we call the sporangia. And these sporangia, they contain certain reproductive cells. They contain, certain kind of reproductive cells, and these reproductive cells which are present on them are called spores. So you will see that there are, certain kind of reproductive cells, and I'll tell you how they reproduce in just a while. So these reproductive cells are called spores. They are like some kind of seeds. Okay, they are kind of seeds, and these seeds, they help in spreading the spore, spreading the fungus, and developing the fungus. This base kind of thing is called the hypha. Right, it's called the hypha. Right, now basically what happens is this bread mold develops in hot and humid conditions, right? It develops in hot and humid conditions, and at a point after its development, these sporangia, right, the sporangia which contains spores, they tend to burst, or they tend to open up. Now, due to the opening up of these sporangia, these spores escape out. And as they escape out, they are carried by mainly the air, okay? And they go and land on various other things. So it may be another piece of bread, right? It may be another piece of bread, or it may be the same piece of bread, or it may be some fruit kept nearby, like a tomato. So it may be a tomato. And wherever they drop, they will develop another fungus or rhizopus. Right? So that is how spore formation takes place. It's basically in hot and humid conditions, these things develop, and these contain spores. After a point, at a particular circumstance, in particular conditions, it will break the sporangia. The sporangium will burst, it will open up, and the spores will escape out, and by the action of air and wind and whatnot, it will be carried to various other places, such as another bread, another food particle, or even on the same bread on a different surface, right? And this will again give rise to another rhizopus. Right, so that is what we call spore formation. When the spore develops, spore grows and spore forms to give rise to more spores, that is called spore formation, right? I hope everyone is clear with spore formation completely. It's very easy. Now we are left with two other reproductive methods of asexual form of reproduction: vegetative propagation and regeneration. In the next video, we will be discussing about these two: vegetative propagation, which is slightly, long, and regeneration, which is really short. So we'll discuss these two in the next video. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you understood something. Your doubts were clear. You understood something from this chapter. It is a very, very essential chapter, as I've told you before, and I hope you enjoyed this session with me and you learned something. Thank you very much for joining me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Please subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to write any doubts or comments or suggestions in the comment section below. Thank you for joining me today. Stay healthy, stay smart, and do keep studying. Goodbye.